Senator Chris Murphy didn't just criticize Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem. He essentially put the entire Department of Homeland Security on trial in public view, and the implications of what he laid out are serious, structural, and frankly unsettling if you care about the rule of law.
Madam Chair, Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. I'm sorry that I missed your call yesterday. I look forward to working closely with you. I say this with seriousness and respect, but your department is out of control. You are spending like you don't have a budget. You're on the verge of running out of money for the fiscal year. You are illegally refusing to spend funds that have been authorized by this Congress and appropriated by this committee. You are ignoring the immigration laws of this nation, implementing a brand new immigration system that you have invented that has little relation to the statutes that you are required, that you are commanded to follow, as spelled out in your oath of office. You are routinely violating the rights of immigrants who may not be citizens, but whether you like it or not, they have constitutional and statutory rights when they reside in the United States. Your agency acts as if laws don't matter, as if the election gave you some mandate to violate the Constitution and the laws passed by this Congress. It did not give you that mandate. You act as if your disagreement with the law, or even the public's disagreement with the law, is relevant and gives you the ability to create your own law. It does not give you that ability. Let's start with your spending. You are on track to trigger the Anti-Deficiency Act. That means you are going to spend more money than you have been allocated by Congress. This is a rare occurrence, and it is wildly illegal. Your agency will be broke by July, over 2 months before the end of the fiscal year. You may not think that Congress has provided enough money to ICE, but the Constitution and the federal law does not allow you to spend more money than you have been given or to invent money. And this obsession with spending at the border, as the chairwoman mentioned, has left the country unprotected elsewhere. The security threats to the United States are higher, not lower, than when Trump came to office. To fund the border, you have illegally gutted spending for cybersecurity. As we speak, Russian and Chinese hackers are having a field day attacking our nation. You've withdrawn funds for disaster prevention. Storms are going to kill more people in this country because of your illegal withholding of these funds. Your myopia about the border, fueled by President Trump's prejudice against people who speak a different language, has shattered many of this country's most important defenses. Now let's talk about the impoundments. When Congress appropriates funds for a specific purpose, the administration has no discretion as to whether to spend or not spend that money unless you go through a very specific process with this committee. Let me give you two of many instances of this illegal impoundment. The first is the Shelter and Services Program. Senator Britt may want to zero that account out, but that account is funded, and it was funded in a bipartisan way. You don't like the program. Your policy is to treat migrants badly. I think that's abhorrent, but it doesn't matter that you don't like the program. You cannot cancel spending in this program, and you cannot use the funds as you have to fund other things, like ICE. You have also canceled citizenship and integration grants, which help lawful permanent residents become citizens, helping them take the citizenship test. I know your goal is to try to make life as hard as possible for immigrants, but that goal is not broadly shared by the American public. That's why Congress, in a bipartisan way, for decades, has funded this program to help immigrants in this country become citizens. Now let's talk about why encounters at the southern border are down so much. This is clearly going to be your primary talking point today. You will tell us that it represents a success. But the primary reason why encounters are down is because you are brazenly violating the law every hour of every day. You are refusing to allow people showing up at the southern border to apply for asylum. I acknowledge that you don't believe that people should be able to apply for asylum, but you don't get to choose that. The White House doesn't get to choose that. The law requires you to process people who are showing up at the border and who claim asylum. Why? Because our asylum law is a bipartisan commitment, an effort to correct for our nation's unconscionable decision to deny entry to Jews to this country who were being hunted and killed by the Nazis. Our nation, Republicans and Democrats, decided, wrote it into law, that we would not repeat that horror ever again, and thus we would allow for people who were fleeing terror and torture to come here, arrive at the border, and make a case for asylum. Finally, let's talk about these disappearances. In an autocratic society, people who the regime does not like are people who are protesting the regime. They are just often picked up off the street, spirited away, sometimes to open-ended detention, sometimes they're never seen again. What you are doing, both the individuals who have legal rights to stay here, like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, or students who are just protesting Trump's policies, is immoral. And to follow the theme, it is illegal. You have no right to deport a student visa holder with no due process simply because they have spoken in a way that offends the president. You can't remove migrants who a court has given humanitarian protection from removal. Now, reports suggest that you are planning to remove immigrants with no due process and send them to prisons in Libya. Libya is in the middle of a civil war. It is subject to a level 4 travel advisory, meaning we tell American citizens never to travel to Libya. We don't have an embassy there because it is not safe for our diplomats. Sending migrants with pending asylum claims into a war zone just because it's cruel is so deeply disturbing. Listen, I understand that my Republican colleagues on this committee don't view the policy the way that I do. My Republican colleagues don't share my level of concern for the way that this administration treats immigrants. That's fine. But what I don't understand is why we don't have consensus in the Senate and on this committee on the decision by this administration to impound the spending that we have decided together to allocate in defense of this nation. We as an appropriations committee, we work interminable hours to write and pass a budget. This budget is really hard to write and pass. And so we make ourselves irrelevant when we allow the administration to ignore what we have decided. And then when we look the other way, when the administration rounds up immigrants who are here illegally and have committed no offenses worthy of detainment, we also do potential irreversible damage to the Constitution. These should not be partisan concerns, destroying the power of Congress, eroding individuals' constitutional rights. This should matter to both parties. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you. Madam Secretary, one of the accounts that right now is being impounded, I mentioned it in my opening statement, is the Shelter and Services Program. I certainly understand that as a program that Republicans, unfortunately, have not supported, but it was a major element of the budget that we passed, and thus far there are somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 million that you have not expended. Can you commit to this committee, understanding that you have the ability to decide how that money is spent and who gets that money within the parameters dictated by Congress, but can you commit to this committee that you are going to spend the money in the Shelter and Services account according to the authorization provided to you by Congress?
Sir, we have followed authorizations and the law and how these dollars are being spent. We are not conducting any impoundment. And as you know, under the previous administration, the Shelter and Services Program was being used to facilitate illegal immigration and shelter for criminals in many areas. And so we are using those dollars to how they were intended by Congress when those dollars were put into that program.
But you haven't spent really any of those dollars other than those that you've reprogrammed. So I certainly understand that you do have a right to spend a little bit of time on review, but you do have to spend those dollars. Can you commit to us that you are going to spend the dollars in the Shelter and Services Program on the functionalities and programmatic parameters authorized by Congress?
We're going to follow the authorities that we have under the Department of Homeland Security and the administration for how Congress appropriates funds. Absolutely, we will follow what is authorized and what is the process for how those are traditionally spent.
Madam Chair, my guess is that the administration is not going to spend any of the SSP dollars, that by the end of the year, those dollars will not be spent. And I raise this issue because I admit that this was a priority for Democrats, and that money was included in the budget in exchange for other funds that were priorities for Republicans. If we now live in a world in which the administration spends down the accounts that were priorities for Republicans and does not spend down the priorities that were priorities for Democrats, I don't know how we do a budget. I don't actually know how we come to an agreement if we live in a world in which the administration doesn't spend the accounts that it doesn't believe in. That would be precedent breaking for this Congress. And so I raise this issue because I think it's very relevant to our work, and I think it will make it virtually impossible for us to do a bipartisan budget if by the end of this fiscal year, the $600 million that are sitting in this account that are supposed to be used to treat migrants to this country humanely are not used. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So I want to slow this down for a second, because this hearing deserves more than a quick reaction or a hot take. What you just watched wasn't normal, and I don't mean dramatic for Washington. I mean structurally not normal. This wasn't a senator nitpicking policy details. This wasn't left versus right cable news noise. This was someone inside the system essentially saying, out loud, "We are breaking the basic rules, and nobody seems to be stopping it." And that should stop you in your tracks. Because the core issue here isn't immigration. It's not even the border. Those are the surface-level arguments everyone fights about because they're emotionally charged and politically useful. The real issue is whether laws are still binding, or whether they've become optional depending on who's in charge and what they want to accomplish. Think about what was actually alleged here. Spending money that hasn't been authorized. Refusing to spend money that has been authorized. Ignoring court protections. Blocking asylum claims entirely. Floating deportations to places so dangerous we won't even send our own diplomats there. That's not strong leadership. That's the executive branch daring Congress to do something about it. And here's the part people don't like to hear. Congress usually doesn't. Not because they agree, not because they don't see the problem, but because confrontation is hard, oversight is messy, and the political cost feels high, especially when the people being affected don't have much political power to begin with. So instead, things slide. And once they slide far enough, they stop feeling shocking. They start feeling routine. That's how norms die. Not with a bang, but with paperwork, silence, and the phrase, "This is just how it works now." Murphy wasn't just criticizing a department. He was warning Congress about itself. He was basically saying, if we pass budgets that don't get followed, if we write laws that don't get enforced, if we allow rights to be ignored because it's inconvenient, then what exactly are we doing here? At that point, Congress isn't a co-equal branch of government. It's background noise. And once you accept that, the rest comes fast. Because when spending limits don't matter, power concentrates. When due process doesn't matter, fear replaces law. When rights only apply to people the government likes, they're not rights anymore. They're permissions. And permissions can be revoked. That's why this matters even if you don't care about immigration. That's why it matters even if you disagree with Murphy politically. That's why it matters even if you think the border is a mess and something drastic needs to be done. Because the question isn't what the government is doing, it's how it's doing it, and whether there are still lines it won't cross. Murphy's argument, stripped down to its core, is simple. You don't get to ignore the law just because you won an election. You don't get to rewrite statutes on the fly. You don't get to decide whose rights count this year. If we lose that principle, everything else is just branding. And the scariest part of this hearing wasn't anything Murphy said. It was the fact that accusations this serious can be made, on the record, in a Senate hearing, and the expectation is that nothing will happen next. No emergency action. No immediate accountability. No hard stop. Just moving on. That's not how a healthy system works. So yeah, this wasn't just another clip. It wasn't just another fight. It was a warning that the guardrails are being tested in real time. And whether you think they're already gone or barely holding on depends on whether people watching this actually care enough to demand that the rules still mean something. Because once the rules stop mattering, it won't just be someone else who feels it. It never is. As always, thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, hit that like button, subscribe for more content like this, and we'll see you next time.